The morning started quiet with low clouds hanging over the Malibu hills. The air smelled of wet earth and salt from the ocean below. For a week, rain had pounded the coast, washing down loose soil and shaking the steep hillsides. When the sun finally came out, it looked peaceful again. But the damage beneath the surface was far from over. A small crew of builders had been sent to clear the remains of a landslide that had torn through an old, unused road above the cliffs. The slope had given way overnight, bringing down trees, stones, and broken pieces of asphalt. Trucks lined up, engines rumbling, while the workers began to dig out the path with heavy machines. To them, it was just another cleanup job after a storm. None of them expected to find something that would reopen a mystery that had been buried for nearly 50 years. By mid-morning, the ground was soft and slippery. As the excavator clawed through layers of mud, something metallic caught the light. At first, one of the workers thought it was a piece of old pipe, or maybe part of a guardrail. But as more of the mud was pushed aside, the shape became clearer, a curved edge, then a roof, and finally what looked like the corner of a car door. They shut off the engines and called over the site supervisor. Everyone gathered around, staring at the strange discovery. The car was completely covered in dirt and tangled roots, as if the hillside had swallowed it whole decades ago. The paint was faded and chipped, but under the grime you could still see a faint color, something between gold and bronze. The supervisor called the local authorities right away. Within an hour, a pair of sheriff's deputies arrived with an evidence team. The workers stepped back, whispering among themselves as the professionals took over. One of them, a tall officer with a careful way of speaking, examined the car closely before saying, "This looks like it's been here for a very long time." The process of pulling the car out was slow. They had to move the dirt layer by layer to avoid damaging what could be evidence. By afternoon, the crew had exposed most of the vehicle. It was an older model sports car, one that hadn't been made in decades. The license plate was caked in mud, but when they cleaned it off, the numbers and letters were still visible. The deputy radioed them in, and for a moment, the site went completely quiet. A short time later, the deputy came back. His expression changed. He looked serious now, almost pale. "This plate is registered to someone named Evelyn Drake," he said. "She went missing back in 1978. The name meant nothing to the younger workers, but one of the older ones stopped what he was doing." He rubbed his hands on his jeans and said softly, "Wait a second. Evelyn Drake? You mean the actress? The one who disappeared all those years ago?" The deputy nodded. News travels fast in small places. By evening, camera crews and reporters had gathered behind the police tape. The story spread quickly. An old car found under a landslide, possibly connected to a famous missing actress. People from the nearby town drove up to watch from a distance, whispering about what it could mean. Some remembered her face from old posters or TV reruns, a young woman with bright eyes and a shy smile who had vanished at the height of her fame. As daylight faded, investigators brought in lights and began carefully opening the car. They expected to find nothing but debris, but when the door finally creaked open, the flashlights caught something that froze everyone in place. Inside the driver's seat were the remains of a person, still buckled in, preserved by layers of mud and time. The scene turned quiet again. Even the sound of the ocean below seemed to fade. The deputies stepped back, giving the forensic team room to work. No one said much. They all knew they had just uncovered more than a car. They had uncovered a story that had been buried for almost half a century. The body was treated with respect. The coroner's van arrived after dark, and the remains were gently taken away under a black tarp. The vehicle was loaded onto a flatbed and covered as well. Once the trucks left, the hillside seemed to fall silent again, as if it too was holding its breath. At the small police station later that night, the investigators began looking up old records. The missing persons report for Evelyn Drake had been filed on March 14, 1978. It stated that she had left a studio party late at night and was last seen driving toward the coast. She had told a few close friends she needed time to think, but promised to call them the next morning. That call never came. Her disappearance had been front-page news for weeks back then. Some said she had run away to start a new life. Others believed she had been kidnapped. A few thought she had taken her own life. But no one ever found her car. And without it, the case went cold. Now, almost 50 years later, her name was suddenly back in the headlines. The next morning, the site was sealed off for a deeper investigation. Forensic experts in white suits combed through the area, collecting samples and taking photographs. They found bits of jewelry, a small leather bag, and a silver bracelet still clasped around the skeleton's wrist. The items were sent to the lab for analysis, but already there was little doubt. This was indeed Evelyn Drake. Back in town, people talked about nothing else. Older residents remembered the excitement when she first became famous, her appearances at premieres, her interviews on television. She had been described as kind, thoughtful, and a little mysterious. When she vanished, it was like a light had gone out in the golden age of Hollywood. At a nearby cafe, two women sat by the window, watching the news on a small screen. One of them sighed and said, "I always knew something wasn't right about how she disappeared. People don't just vanish like that." The other nodded, stirring her coffee slowly. At least now her family can finally know what happened. Back at the police department, detectives began piecing together the timeline again. How had her car ended up in that exact spot? Had it gone off the road by accident, or had something else happened that night? The hillside where the car was found was steep and narrow, with no guardrails in those days. It was possible she had lost control, especially in the dark. But one detective couldn't shake the feeling that it seemed too far off the main road for a simple crash. As the team examined the first round of photos, something small but strange caught their attention. A set of deep scratches along the side of the car, almost like the marks of another vehicle brushing against it. The mud had preserved the pattern surprisingly well. The detective made a note to have them analyzed later. Meanwhile, across the country, news outlets began retelling Evelyn's story. Archival footage appeared on television, clips from her movies, her smiling at premieres, interviews where she spoke about her dreams and the pressure of fame. Seeing her alive again, even just on screen, made the discovery feel even more haunting. People began leaving flowers near the site where the landslide had occurred, turning it into a quiet memorial. For the construction workers who had first found the car, the discovery stayed with them. One of them said later that he couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about how that car had been there all his life, hidden just a few feet below where people walked and drove every day. "It's strange," he said to a reporter. "You think the past is gone, but it's just waiting to be found." The authorities promised to conduct a full investigation. The remains were sent for identification through dental records and DNA testing. Within days, it was confirmed. The body was indeed Evelyn Drake. The sheriff gave a short statement to the press, saying, "After all these years, we can finally bring closure to a mystery that has touched so many." However, questions remain about the circumstances that led to this tragic event. As night fell again over the Malibu hills, the spot where the landslide had been was quiet. The heavy machines were gone, replaced by soft winds carrying the sound of the sea. The earth looked disturbed, raw, as if it had just revealed a long-kept secret. And though the investigation was only beginning, one thing was clear. The story of Evelyn Drake was not over yet. Long before the landslide uncovered her car, Evelyn Drake had been a familiar face in homes across America. In the late 1970s, she was one of the most promising young actresses in Hollywood. Her career had taken off almost overnight after her role in a hit film called Golden Mirage. People loved her charm, her voice, and the way she seemed so natural on screen. She wasn't like the others. There was something gentle and grounded about her that drew people in. Evelyn came from a small town in Northern California. Her father was a schoolteacher, and her mother worked part-time in a local bakery. She grew up modestly, far away from the glitter of Hollywood. Even after she became famous, she would still visit her hometown, walking through the same streets, greeting the same neighbors. Fame never fully changed her. Friends often said she had an old soul, someone who loved quiet mornings more than big parties. But in 1978, that simplicity had started to slip away. Fame was never easy, and the film industry in those years could be cruel. There were expectations, contracts, public appearances, and rumors. Everyone wanted something from her. Reporters followed her to restaurants, photographers waited outside her home, and gossip magazines invented stories about who she was dating. Evelyn always smiled politely, but inside she was tired. She had just finished her third movie when things began to unravel. People close to her noticed she was becoming more withdrawn. She often left early from events and avoided interviews. Some said she was thinking about taking a break, maybe even leaving the industry for a while. Others thought she was overwhelmed by the attention that came with sudden fame. Whatever the truth was, Evelyn wasn't saying much. In March of that year, she was invited to a studio party in Los Angeles. It was meant to celebrate a new film project she had been offered, a role that could have made her a major star. The party was glamorous, filled with producers, directors, and celebrities. Evelyn arrived wearing a light blue dress and a soft smile. People who saw her that night remembered that she seemed polite but distant, as if her mind was elsewhere. Around midnight, she told a friend she needed to leave early. She said she wanted to take a drive along the coast to clear her head. She left alone, waving goodbye before slipping into her golden sports car. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The next morning, when she didn't show up for a scheduled photo shoot, people assumed she had overslept. By evening, her friends began calling her apartment, but there was no answer. Her car was missing, her phone line was dead, and her neighbors said they hadn't seen her. After 2 days, her assistant filed a missing persons report. The police began searching, but there were no leads, no sign of a crash, no suspicious activity. It was as if Evelyn had simply vanished into thin air. The media exploded with theories. Some claimed she had run away to escape the pressures of fame. Others said she had been secretly dating someone powerful and that something had gone wrong. A few suggested she might have gone abroad to start over. In the absence of evidence, the story became bigger than the truth. For her family, the disappearance was devastating. Her younger sister visited the police every week, hoping for news. Her parents sat by the phone for months, unable to sleep. She would never just leave, her mother told reporters. Something happened to her, and I need to know what. But the investigation kept running into dead ends. The coast roads were searched for weeks, but no car was ever found. Some of the cliffs were too steep, the waters too deep, and the idea of finding anything seemed impossible. As months turned into years, Evelyn's name began to fade from headlines. The movie studios moved on to new stars, and her last film quietly released without much attention. Her family continued to hope, but deep down they knew time was running out. Eventually, her case became one of those Hollywood mysteries people would bring up at dinner parties. A story about beauty, fame, and the darkness that sometimes follows both. Still, not everyone believed she had simply disappeared. A few people from the film industry whispered that she had enemies. She had been outspoken about unfair treatment on set and had argued with a few powerful figures behind closed doors. There were rumors she had been planning to go public with certain information, but no one could say for sure. The police looked into these claims but found no solid proof. Without the car or a body, they couldn't move forward. For years, there were false leads. A woman in Mexico was spotted who looked like Evelyn. Another person claimed to have seen her at a gas station near San Francisco. Every time a sighting came in, her family's hopes lifted, then fell again when it turned out to be nothing. The emotional toll was heavy. Her father passed away in the late 1980s, still believing his daughter was alive somewhere. Her mother held on longer, keeping Evelyn's old photos on the mantelpiece, waiting for the phone to ring. Meanwhile, Hollywood continued to change. The world moved into the 1990s and new generations of actors rose to fame. But among those who had known Evelyn, her story lingered. Some of her co-stars still mentioned her in interviews, describing her as kind and gifted, someone who never got the chance to show her full potential. Every few years, an article would resurface about the vanished actress, reigniting public curiosity. But it always ended the same way. No answers, no closure. Behind the scenes, one retired detective never let go of the case. He had been young when he first worked on it, and something about it haunted him. He often drove the old coastal roads where she was last seen, trying to imagine what might have happened. There were stretches of narrow lanes without guardrails, places where one wrong turn could send a car tumbling down into the canyons or the ocean below. He had always suspected that was where the truth lay, but back then, the technology and resources weren't enough to search those dangerous cliffs properly. In his personal notes, he wrote, "If she went off the road, the car would have been buried or washed away by now. But the hills don't forget forever." He was right. Nature had kept its secret for decades. The rains, the roots, and the earth itself had hidden the truth deep under the hillside. The landslide that came nearly 50 years later was the first to cut deep enough to uncover it. When the news broke that her car had finally been found, people from all over began sharing old photos and memories of Evelyn. Fans who had grown up watching her films posted messages online, saying they still remembered her smile. Former colleagues gave interviews about how talented she had been. Her surviving family, though much older now, spoke through tears, saying they were grateful the truth had finally come out after all these years. But as investigators looked closer at the car and the evidence inside, questions began to rise again. The damage didn't completely match a simple accident. Some of the details felt off, like the deep scratches along the side or the unusual position of certain items. It was possible she had been forced off the road, or that someone had wanted her gone. For the public, the discovery brought closure. But for the detectives, it was the beginning of a new mystery. Evelyn Drake's story was no longer just about a missing actress. It was about what had really happened on that dark road in 1978, and why the truth had taken so long to be found. And as the night fell again over the same hills where her life had ended, one thing was certain: the earth had finally spoken. But it hadn't told everything yet. The discovery of Evelyn Drake's car had stirred more than old memories. It had opened a door to questions that no one had been able to answer for nearly half a century. The town buzzed with speculation, and the police department found itself at the center of a storm. For detectives, what started as an accident investigation was quickly becoming something deeper. At first, the assumption was simple. The road where Evelyn's car was found was known for sharp curves and poor visibility, especially at night. It seemed reasonable to think she might have lost control and gone off the edge, but as forensic experts examined the evidence more closely, that idea began to fall apart. The car's damage didn't fully match an accidental crash. Some parts were too deliberate, too specific to be the result of a single skid or slide. The first major clue came from the side of the vehicle. Technicians noticed deep scratches that looked like they were caused by another car. The marks were old, but their pattern suggested impact, not random scraping. If Evelyn's car had been hit, it might explain how it veered off the road. But that raised a chilling question. Was she alone that night, or had someone followed her? Inside the vehicle, investigators found a few personal items: a compact mirror, an old-style lipstick tube, and a small silver keychain. The keychain was unusual. It had 2 letters engraved on it, J.R. That detail stood out immediately. The initials didn't match Evelyn's, and when detectives searched her personal records, they found no mention of anyone with those initials among her family or staff. It could have been a gift, but from whom? One of the older detectives on the team remembered a name from the original case files, a film producer with a reputation for power and temper, whose initials matched the keychain. Back in the day, he had worked closely with Evelyn on one of her biggest films. Rumors had swirled about arguments between them, but without proof, it had gone nowhere. The man had passed away in the late 1990s, taking his secrets with him. Still, finding his initials in her car was hard to ignore. To confirm the connection, the police reopened the old investigation files. They were yellowed and fragile, filled with typed notes and newspaper clippings. One report mentioned that Evelyn had been seen arguing with that same producer at the studio party the night she vanished. Witnesses described her as upset but calm, saying she left the event alone. No one followed her, at least not that anyone admitted. The more they dug, the stranger the case became. There were inconsistencies in the old witness statements. A few people claimed to have seen the producer leave the party soon after Evelyn did. Others remembered his car being gone for part of the night. But none of that had been properly investigated at the time. Back then, the studios had influence, and no one wanted bad publicity around a young star's disappearance. In the lab, forensic scientists used new technology to analyze the remains. They discovered signs of old injuries on the bones, particularly around the ribs and skull, that didn't match a typical car accident. It was possible the damage came from the crash, but one expert quietly noted that some of the trauma looked more like a blow than impact from the steering wheel. The discovery unsettled the team. It was one thing to uncover a tragic accident. It was another to uncover signs that something violent might have happened before the car went off the road. Detectives decided to trace everyone who had known Evelyn during her final days. Many were gone or retired, but a few were still alive. Some were willing to talk now after all these years. A former makeup artist remembered that Evelyn had been tense during her last weeks on set. She was scared of something, the woman said during an interview. I didn't know what, but I could see it. She'd look over her shoulder when we were alone, like someone might be listening. Another source, a studio assistant who had worked under that same producer, shared that Evelyn had been in a disagreement about her contract. She wanted to leave and start her own production company, but she was being pressured to stay. She told me she didn't trust certain people anymore, the assistant said. She wanted to tell the truth about how things worked behind the scenes. None of this was direct proof, but the pieces started to form a picture of a woman who might have been silenced for trying to speak up. Detectives treaded carefully. Without living witnesses or clear physical evidence of foul play, it would be nearly impossible to label it a murder. Still, they had a responsibility to uncover the truth. As news of the reopened case spread, journalists descended on the area again. Some of them had been young reporters when Evelyn disappeared. They saw this as a final chance to tell the story right. Talk shows and podcasts picked it up, analyzing every clue and speculation. For Evelyn's family, the attention was both painful and comforting. After so many years of silence, people were finally remembering her not as a mystery, but as a person. Her younger sister, now in her 70s, spoke to the media for the first time. Evelyn loved her work, she said. But Hollywood can be a hard place. She told me once she didn't feel safe anymore. I begged her to come home, but she said she had to handle it her way. Maybe that was her mistake, thinking she could face it alone. At the sheriff's office, the lead detective looked over photos of the car for the 100th time. Something about the scene didn't sit right. The car's headlights were still in the off position, which was odd if Evelyn had been driving on a dark mountain road. The key was in the ignition, but turned only halfway as if the engine had stopped before impact. These little details made the case even murkier. One afternoon, an evidence technician returned with a surprising report. Among the mud and rust inside the car, they found faint traces of another person's fingerprints, ones that didn't belong to Evelyn. Unfortunately, they were too degraded for a full match. Still, it confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. She had not been alone when the car went off the road. That discovery changed everything. It was no longer just about what happened to Evelyn. It was about who had been with her and why. The detective began to map out a timeline of the night she vanished. The party ended around midnight. Witnesses said she left soon after. The producer left roughly 15 minutes later. No one could verify where he went afterward. Phone records from that era were limited, but there was a note in the old case file about a mysterious call made from a payphone near the coastal highway, just after 1 a.m. The number dialed was traced to Evelyn's apartment. The line had rung twice, then disconnected. Could she have tried to reach home before the crash? Or had someone else used the phone that night? The detective stood by the evidence board late into the evening, staring at Evelyn's smiling photo, the same one used in magazine covers decades earlier. Her eyes seemed to follow him, calm but questioning. He made a quiet promise to himself that this time, the truth would not be buried. As the investigation moved forward, the hillside where the car had been found became a quiet memorial. Fans left flowers, old movie posters, and notes. Some people lit candles. One card simply read, "You are finally found." Forensic tests continued, and more pieces surfaced from the wreckage. A torn page from a notebook, part of a bracelet, a faint trace of perfume that still lingered inside the car after all these years. Every fragment felt like a whisper from the past, guiding them closer to what really happened that night. Still, no one could say for sure whether Evelyn had been the victim of an accident or something darker. The earth had revealed her, but it had not revealed her story completely, and somewhere, buried in the mix of old Hollywood secrets and forgotten truths, lay the answer to a question that had haunted everyone who remembered her. Why did Evelyn Drake never make it home that night in 1978? The weeks following the discovery of Evelyn Drake's car were filled with more questions than answers. The world was watching again, just as it had in 1978. But this time there was evidence, pieces of truth long hidden under the earth. For detectives, every clue felt like a small window into her final moments, but the full picture was still blurry. They knew she had died that night. They knew someone else had likely been with her. But who and why? As investigators combed through the old Hollywood records, a clearer story began to form. Back then, the movie business was controlled by a handful of powerful men who could make or break a career with a single phone call. Evelyn had worked with several of them, but one name came up again and again: the same producer whose initials matched the silver keychain found in her car. His reputation had been complicated. On the surface, he was charming, generous, and successful. But behind closed doors, people whispered about his temper, about how he treated those who disagreed with him. One of the detectives tracked down the producer's former driver, now retired and living quietly in another state. At first, the man was hesitant to talk, saying it was all too long ago. But when he learned that Evelyn's remains had been found, he sighed heavily and agreed to meet. During the interview, he admitted that the producer had left the party that night, not long after Evelyn did. He said he was going to catch up with her, the man recalled. He told me to wait, but he never came back until early morning. His car had dirt all over the tires, and he didn't say a word. It was a small detail, but it gave detectives a new lead. If the producer had indeed followed her that night, it could explain the damage to her car. It also matched the time when a call had been made from a nearby payphone to Evelyn's apartment. The question was, what had happened between the time she left the party and the moment her car went off the road? To piece that together, investigators revisited the geography of the area. The coastal road was quiet at night, winding through cliffs that dropped sharply into the ocean. It was a dangerous stretch, especially before guardrails were installed in the 1980s. Drivers had to be careful, but Evelyn had been familiar with that road. She often took drives there when she needed peace. That made it less likely that she'd simply lost control. The search team returned to the site where the car had been found, this time exploring a wider area. They found faint traces of old tire marks buried deep in the soil above the crash site, parallel to where Evelyn's car had likely gone over. It looked like another vehicle had been there too, perhaps tailing her or blocking her path. Even after decades, the land had kept its memory. As the investigation deepened, reporters began uncovering their own angles. A few journalists found old letters that Evelyn had written to a friend shortly before her disappearance. In one note, she mentioned feeling watched and said she was tired of pretending everything was fine. She also wrote that she planned to speak out soon, no matter the cost. Those words echoed through every newsroom, sparking a wave of renewed attention. People began to wonder if her death had really been an accident, or if someone had wanted her silence. Her family followed every update closely. Her sister gave another brief interview saying, Evelyn was brave. If she knew something was wrong, she wouldn't have hidden forever. Maybe she trusted the wrong person. Her eyes filled with tears, but she spoke calmly, almost as if she had been waiting years to say it. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued analyzing the small details. The scratches on the car's side were confirmed to be caused by another vehicle. Paint residue from the marks revealed a different color, black metallic, a common finish used on luxury cars of that time. When detectives compared it with vehicle registrations linked to the producer, they found that he had owned a black sports sedan in 1978. It was circumstantial, but it was another piece that fit the puzzle. The deeper they went, the more it seemed that Evelyn had been caught in a situation she couldn't escape from. She might have confronted someone powerful, or maybe she had planned to leave and take information with her. Either way, that night had been the turning point. Despite the growing evidence, prosecutors could never bring charges. Everyone directly involved was gone. The producer had died decades ago, and many others had passed on or were too old to remember clearly. The case became one of those haunting truths that came too late for justice, but not too late for understanding. Still, the investigation wasn't in vain. For Evelyn's family and the public, knowing the truth mattered. The detective leading the case decided to release a detailed report, laying out everything they had discovered. It concluded that Evelyn Drake likely died after being forced off the road in an encounter with another vehicle. Whether it was intentional or the result of panic, no one could say. But it was clear she hadn't simply driven off by mistake. When the report was published, the story took on a new life. Documentaries began production. Former colleagues appeared in interviews expressing sorrow and guilt. She was trying to change things, one actor said softly on camera. But back then, people didn't listen. She deserved better. The public response was emotional. Fans visited the site where her car had been found, leaving flowers, candles, and photographs. Some wrote messages on small notes. You were brave. We remember you. You finally found peace. The hillside that had once hidden her became a quiet place of reflection. It wasn't about fame anymore. It was about closure. For the lead detective, the case left a lasting mark. Late one evening, he drove back to the coast road alone. He parked his car and stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out at the dark waves below. The air was cool and the ocean moved in slow, endless rhythm. He thought about Evelyn, not as a name in a file, but as a young woman who had dreams, laughter, and fear like anyone else. "You're home now," he whispered before turning back toward his car. In the months that followed, a small film crew began working on a documentary about her life. They interviewed her friends, co-stars, and even some of the investigators. The goal was not to dwell on the tragedy, but to remember her as a person. The way she had smiled, the way she had worked hard, the way she had cared about doing things right. The film was titled The Hills Remember, a nod to the land that had finally given up its secret. When the documentary premiered, audiences were deeply moved. It showed not only Evelyn's final mystery, but also the human cost of silence and ambition. It was a story of how truth sometimes takes decades to surface, and how people can be forgotten too easily in the rush of fame. Her sister attended the premiere, sitting quietly in the front row. As the credits rolled, she closed her eyes and whispered a small thank you, as if Evelyn could somehow hear it. For her, this was the end of a long, painful journey. She no longer needed to wonder what had happened on that dark night in 1978. The truth, however heavy, was finally known. And as the world moved on from the headlines once again, Evelyn Drake's story stayed with those who had followed it. It became a reminder that no matter how much time passes, some voices still find a way to be heard. The Hills had kept her secret for nearly 50 years, but in the end they gave her back her story. Months passed after the case of Evelyn Drake was officially closed, but the world didn't forget. Her name became a symbol of the quiet battles many people fought behind the glitter of fame. She was no longer just the actress who vanished in 1978. She was the woman whose story refused to stay buried. For the people who had worked on the investigation, life slowly returned to normal, but something about Evelyn stayed with them. The lead detective often said it felt like she had guided them to her, that the land itself had waited until the right moment to reveal her truth. Even the construction workers who had first uncovered the car said they sometimes drove by the site, just to make sure the area stayed peaceful. The hillside had been reinforced after the landslide, but visitors still came. They left small flowers, notes, or photos. Some came out of curiosity, others out of respect. It wasn't unusual to find someone sitting quietly near the edge, watching the ocean and thinking about how easily life can change in a single night. The story also changed how people saw the film industry from that era. Reporters and filmmakers began to revisit old Hollywood stories not for gossip, but to understand what had been hidden. People who had once stayed silent began to speak up about the struggles actors faced back then, the pressure, the secrets, the power imbalance. Evelyn's name was mentioned often in those conversations, always with sadness but also admiration. Her sister found herself receiving letters from strangers all over the world. Some wrote that they had grown up watching Evelyn's movies and still remembered her kindness on screen. Others shared how her story gave them courage to speak their own truth. She kept every letter, reading them on quiet afternoons. "She's still touching lives," she would say softly, smiling through tears. A few months later, the documentary, The Hills Remember, was released worldwide. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It told Evelyn's story gently, focusing on her life more than her death. It showed clips from her early interviews, moments where she laughed between takes and the humble beginnings that had made her who she was. The film ended with slow shots of the Malibu coastline, the same hills and ocean that had kept her secret for so long. Audiences were deeply moved. Many people said they cried not because of the tragedy, but because it felt like she had finally come home. The film sparked new conversations online. Younger generations who had never heard of Evelyn before began to search for her old movies. Streaming platforms even re-released some of her work, and suddenly her name appeared again in the credits of trending lists. People posted scenes from her films, writing things like, "Gone but never forgotten," or "She still feels real." It was as if time had folded, and Evelyn was once again lighting up the screen. Back in California, her family worked with local officials to create a small memorial near the site of the landslide. It wasn't large, just a stone plaque with her name, her birth and death years, and a short quote she had once said during an interview. "The world is noisy, but truth always finds a voice." The memorial was placed under a single oak tree that overlooked the ocean. On windy days, the leaves rustled softly, almost like whispers. The day the memorial was unveiled, a small crowd gathered. There were former co-stars, old friends, journalists, and a few of the people who had worked on the investigation. Her sister spoke briefly, thanking everyone who had helped bring the truth to light. "Evelyn loved these hills," she said. "Now they'll always be part of her story." As she placed a white rose on the plaque, the crowd fell silent. The ocean below sparkled in the afternoon light, and for a moment it felt as if the whole world was still. Afterward, the detective stood quietly off to the side. He wasn't one for speeches, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He thought about how long it had taken for this truth to surface, nearly half a century. Sometimes he realized, justice doesn't come in the form of punishment. Sometimes it comes in the form of remembrance. Evelyn's legacy continued to grow in small, meaningful ways. A scholarship fund was established in her name to help aspiring actors who came from small towns like she did. The scholarship focused on those who wanted to study film but couldn't afford it. Her sister personally reviewed the first batch of applicants, smiling at how many young people wrote that Evelyn's story had inspired them to never give up. "That's what she would have wanted," she said quietly. The old detective retired soon after the case closed, but Evelyn's file stayed on his desk until his last day. Before leaving, he placed the file into the archives, writing one last note on the inside cover: "She is finally home." Years later, The Hills Remember won a few small film awards for its storytelling and emotional depth. During the ceremony, the director dedicated the film to Evelyn and to all the voices history almost forgot. The audience rose to their feet, clapping for a woman who had not lived to see her justice but had still left her mark on the world. Over time, people began to say her name with warmth instead of sadness. She became a part of local folklore, the actress who vanished, the hills that remembered, and the truth that refused to stay hidden. Tourists visiting Malibu often asked about her story, and locals would point toward the cliffs and say, "That's where they found her car." But they always said it softly, like they were talking about someone they still cared for. One summer, a young filmmaker visited the memorial site to pay his respects. He had been born decades after Evelyn's death, but had grown fascinated by her story. Standing under the oak tree, he left a small camera charm on the plaque and whispered, "Thank you for reminding us to look closer." He would later go on to make his own film about forgotten stars of the past, inspired by Evelyn's courage. In a quiet way, her influence lived on through others like him. As time went on, the hills changed again. New homes were built nearby, trees grew taller, and the road was repaired. But the small memorial remained untouched. Locals made sure it was cared for, cleaning it whenever storms passed through. Some said that on clear nights when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear a faint hum near the cliffs, like a melody carried on the air. People liked to imagine it was Evelyn's voice, still echoing softly across the ocean. Her story had started as a tragedy, but it ended as something else entirely, a lesson about patience, truth, and the way time can heal even the deepest mysteries. She had been buried by the earth for decades, but in the end, the same earth had given her back, piece by piece, until her name once again meant something beautiful. The final chapter of her story wasn't about loss. It was about discovery. It reminded people that truth doesn't disappear, even when buried under time and silence. Somewhere, somehow it waits, for the rain, the wind, or a simple shift in the ground to rise again. And so, the hills of Malibu still stand quietly, facing the ocean. The wind moves through the grass, the waves crash against the rocks below, and the earth holds countless untold stories. But one of them, at least, has been told. The story of Evelyn Drake, the actress who vanished in 1978, will forever remind the world that even in silence, truth endures. And though her life ended far too soon, her voice, soft, human, and unforgettable, sent